The paper felt cold and foreign in my hands, a stark contrast to the ever-present warmth of the machinery I loved. The words on it, however, were searing brands. My parents transferred the family shop to my sister's husband. That single sentence, typed in sterile, legalistic font, didn't just hurt. It initiated a chemical burn behind my eyes, a toxic mix of betrayal and disbelief that threatened to spill over. I stood frozen under the familiar flicker of the factory's fluorescent lights, the ghost of the day's engine oil still darkening the whorls of my fingerprints, the scent of metal shavings and sweat clinging to my clothes. 10 years. A decade measured not in birthdays or anniversaries, but in 80-hour weeks that bled into one another. In Christmas Eve spent calibrating the CNC mill for a rush order. The scent of pine and turkey, a distant memory, replaced by the tang of cutting fluid. In calluses that had become permanent fixtures on my palms, each one a tiny hardened monument to a problem solved, a deadline met. In the thin white scar on my forearm from the time a snapped drive belt had lashed out like a viper, and the deeper, invisible one on my knee from the day I fell while carrying a load of steel stock, too proud and too stupid to ask for help. Every holiday missed, every personal sacrifice explained away with a weary, "It's for the family." Every scar, physical and emotional, earned in the unwavering belief that I was the guardian of a legacy, gone, erased with a signature I never saw, on a document I was never meant to know existed. The people who knew the surface-level version of this story, the few co-workers I'd let in, my friend Tori, would have expected a spectacle. They'd have anticipated a scream tearing from my throat, raw and guttural. The satisfying crash of a wrench against a metal cabinet. The shattering of glass. Perhaps a desperate, pleading phone call, begging for an explanation, for a reversal, for a shred of the recognition I'd craved for so long. But I did none of those things. The chaos inside me crystallized into a cold, unnerving calm. I walked to the deep, industrial sink in the corner, the one with the perpetually dripping faucet. I turned the hot water on, watching the steam rise, and methodically scrubbed my hands. The orange dial soap foamed, lifting the grime from my skin, revealing the person underneath, the person they had chosen to disregard. I rinsed, dried my hands on a clean rag from my back pocket, and walked to the peg by the door where my heavy, waxed canvas apron had hung for a decade. I hung it up. The motion was final, like closing a coffin. Then I walked out into the biting embrace of the November snow, the flakes catching in my hair and melting on my still warm skin without uttering a single word. I knew what they would think. My silence would be interpreted as shock, as defeat, as a quiet acceptance of my fate. They would mistake my lack of noise for a lack of strength. But a week later, when my phone lit up with my father's name, his voice a panicked, static-filled tremor because Title Steel, our biggest client, the account I'd personally nurtured since I was 25, was pulling the plug. I answered on the fourth ring. My voice was as steady as the lathe I'd left behind. Let the air handle it. The silence that followed on his end was more telling than any confession. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. You see, silence isn't always surrender. It isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's the deep, gathering breath before a storm. Sometimes it's the first, resonant sound of someone mapping out the path to take back everything they were ever owed. The inheritance wasn't presented in a velvet-lined box. There was no gold watch, no stock certificate. When I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in business management that my father insisted would be useful for the books, he led me into the heart of Rowan Metalworks. The air thrummed with a power that felt more alive than anything on a university campus. He stopped by my grandfather's original workbench, its surface a topographical map of dings, burns, and oil stains accumulated over 40 years. From a hook above it, he took down a pair of safety goggles, the plastic scratched to a milky haze, the elastic strap frayed and stretched. He placed them in my hands. They were still warm from the ambient heat of the shop. "This, my father," Daniel Rowan said, his voice competing with the growl of a nearby air compressor, "is your inheritance. Learn to earn it." That was 10 years ago, and I took his words as gospel. The shop didn't just become my workplace. It became my ecosystem, my identity. The endless buzz of the white LED lights was my son. The symphony of aging machines, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the stamping press, the high-pitched whine of the bandsaw, the low, powerful hum of the CNC mill was the music I conducted. My world was measured in millimeters and microns, in torque and tensile strength. The sensory landscape was one of hot metal, the bitter scent of EP308 cutting oil, the feel of fine, metallic dust on my skin, and the occasional, sharp sting of a burnt fingertip on a freshly machined part. I was the first to arrive in the pre-dawn gloom, my old truck's headlights cutting through the mist in the parking lot. I was the last to leave, often long after the sun had set, my shadow a giant against the wall as I performed the sacred shutdown ritual, bleeding the airlines, wiping down the machines, sweeping my corner of the universe clean. I wasn't just an employee. I was the operational spine of the place. I ran the toughest shifts because no one else wanted the 4 a.m. start or the midnight oil. I learned the machines not from a manual, but through a kind of osmosis. I knew the particular squeak the main drive belt made on the lathe when it needed tightening, the worrisome vibration in the milling machine that signaled a worn bearing, the exact amount of persuasion a specific stubborn bolt required. I could diagnose a problem by its sound, its smell, by the way the machine felt. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was protecting something sacred. This was the kingdom my grandfather, Arthur Rowan, had built from literal scrap in 1970. He'd been a man of few words, but the ones he spoke were weighted with truth. I could still picture him, his coveralls perpetually stained, his hands a network of scars and strength, standing beside me at the old manual lathe. "Remember, Kelsey," he'd say, his voice a low rumble, his hand resting on my shoulder. "Steel remembers the hands that shape it. It remembers care. It remembers force. It remembers the intention behind every cut. Don't you ever forget that." I never did. My mother, Eleanor, was a silent partner in every sense. She handled the books from a small, tidy office upstairs, but her presence on the floor was like a ghost's. She'd smile, a tight, nervous thing, and nod, but her eyes would dart away from the sparks, flinch at the sudden hiss of the hydraulic press. Her world was one of balance sheets and quiet anxiety, and she navigated the roaring chaos of the shop floor as if it were a minefield. My younger sister, Jenna, had made her disinterest clear by the time she was 16. She preferred the scent of photocopier toner to that of machine oil, the hum of a server room to the roar of a forge. Conference rooms with polished tables and PowerPoint presentations were her natural habitat. She'd visit the shop on rare occasions, her designer heels clicking a staccato rhythm of disapproval on the concrete floor, her nose subtly wrinkled. And then there was Mason Pierce, Jenna's husband. A business strategist. The first time I met him, he'd worn a suit to a family barbecue. His handshake was a calculated, limp gesture, his palms soft and unlined. Next to my own, still rough from the morning's work, they felt like the hands of a different species. My father clapped him on the back, his voice booming with a pride I rarely heard directed at me. "This is Mason," Dad announced, as if presenting a trophy, "the future of Rowan Metalworks." I remember forcing a smile, my grease-stained work gloves tucked into my belt like a badge of honor he would never earn. His grip was soft, and that, though I didn't know it then, was the precise moment the tectonic plates of my life began their slow, inexorable shift. The small things started first, tiny fissures in the foundation of my reality. Mason began showing up on Saturdays, not to work, but for staged photo ops. I'd see him posing beside a machine he didn't know how to turn on, let alone operate, a hard hat perched awkwardly on his perfectly styled hair. He'd hold a clean blueprints, upside down. My father would snap the pictures, beaming, and immediately share them on the company's social media with captions like, "Next-gen leadership getting hands-on." The likes would pile up from people who didn't know any better. Company perks, once sparse and evenly distributed, began funneling toward Mason. A new company car, a sleek black SUV, appeared in the parking lot with his name on the lease. My own vehicle, a 20-year-old pickup truck with a rust-speckled bed and a heater that coughed and sputtered in second gear, sat beside it like a poor relation. One late evening, I was elbows deep in the CNC mill, recalibrating the tool offsets after a particularly tough run of 4,140 steel. The shop was quiet, save for the whirring of my tools and the radio playing classic rock softly in the background. Mason walked by, scrolling through his phone, not even looking up. "Don't stay too late, Kelsey," he said, his voice dismissive, his eyes still glued to the screen. Optics matter. Optics, the word hung in the oil-scented air, toxic and alien. He cared about the picture, the perception, the superficial gloss. Not the work, not the truth of the thing. Not the heart and soul that went into making a perfect part, into keeping the ancient, cantankerous machines alive and productive. That was the first hairline crack. A tiny, almost invisible fracture in the lens through which I viewed my world. By the time winter tightened its grip on the city, the wind howling outside the corrugated steel walls, I could hear something else breaking beneath the familiar hum of the machinery. It was the sound of my own place in this world, slowly and systematically being erased. March arrived like a lion, bringing with it a blow I never saw coming. It was subtle at first, a change in the company-wide email headers. Where it once read, "Daniel Rowan, owner, Kelsey Rowan, shop foreman," it now read, "Operations Director, Mason Pierce." My title was still there, but it was buried, subordinate. The approval signatures on work orders and purchase requisitions began to tell a new story. It used to be just mine and my dad's. Now it was a triumvirate: Kelsey, Rowan, Daniel Rowan, Mason Pierce. His signature, a loopy, self-important scrawl, was always last, as if having the final say. Meetings I had run for years were now scheduled around Mason's calendar. My father would sit at the head of the table, but his eyes would constantly flick to Mason. "What's your read on this, Mason? Mason, how should we position this for the clients?" My input, when I gave it, was met with nods, but then immediately deferred. "Mason, what do you think of Kelsey's idea?" It was as if my thoughts were in a foreign language that only Mason could translate into actionable strategy. My mother, at family dinners I now dreaded, began to parrot his phrases. "We need to leverage our core competencies," she'd say, passing the mashed potatoes, her eyes avoiding mine. "It's all about the value add." A language of business consultants had infected our home, and it felt like a virus degrading the simple, honest DNA of our family. Then came the day I opened my social media feed and saw a photo of my workstation. The solid oak bench my grandfather had built with his own hands, its surface scarred and stained with decades of honest work. Mason had taken a picture of himself leaning against it, a smug smile on his face. The caption made my blood run cold, "Continuing the Rowan legacy, honored to be steering the ship." My name wasn't in the post. My presence, my decade of labor at that very bench, was airbrushed out of history. I was a ghost in my own life. But the dagger, the one that found the space between my ribs and twisted, came during a client meeting. The representative from Titan Steel was there, and I was walking him through the nuances of a new alloy we were prototyping. I was in my element, explaining grain structure, heat treatment, and fatigue limits. The client was engaged, nodding, asking intelligent questions. My father was watching. At the end of my explanation, the client turned to my dad and said, "She's incredible. You're lucky to have her." My father puffed out his chest, looked directly at Mason and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's leadership, son." The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead. The air was sucked out of it. I saw the client's confused glance flick from me to Mason and back again. I saw Jenna's slight, uncomfortable shift in her seat. I saw Mason's smirk. Son. That word, a term of endearment and belonging I had never heard him use for me, landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a word, it was a disowning. It was a public announcement of who truly mattered, who was truly family. It sliced deeper than any metal shard, any snapped cable, any burn I had ever earned on that shop floor. The erosion accelerated through the summer. Mason was given his own office, a clean, air-conditioned box with glass walls, where he could look out upon the messy, productive reality of the floor, without having to hear it or smell it. I remained on the floor, my office a rolling tool cart and the stool by my mill. Clients who had my personal cell number began calling me directly to fix Mason's mistakes. An order would be misscheduled, a specification misread, a promise made that was logistically impossible. I'd get the panicked call, stay late and rework the project, often by hand, to meet the deadline. And at the next meeting, Mason would stand up and take the credit. We faced some headwinds, but my team pivoted effectively, he'd say, without ever glancing in my direction. The final straw, the one that broke the back of my hope, came in November. The mail arrived, and in it was a thick, cream-colored envelope from Titan Steel Dynamics. It was a thank you card. My heart gave a feeble, hopeful flutter. Perhaps, finally. I watched as my father opened it. He read it, a smile spreading across his face. He held it up. "Look at this," he said, beaming. "A thank you card addressed to Mr. Pierce." It was for the Hollander project, a complex tight-tolerance component I had personally machined, a job that had required 3 all-nighters and every ounce of my skill. Mason had only been copied on the emails. I waited for my father to correct the record, to say, "This should be for Kelsey." I waited for a flicker of recognition, of injustice. Instead, he looked at the card again and smiled wider. "Well," he said, placing it on the bulletin board in the kitchen for all to see, "that's good PR for the company." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something in me finally stopped pretending. This wasn't a series of accidents. It wasn't oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. The writing wasn't just on the wall. It was painted in bold, bright letters, and I had simply refused to read it. The night everything shattered was colder than usual, a deep, penetrating cold that seeped through the steel walls of the shop. I was the last one there, as always. The machines were silent, their great hulking forms sleeping in the dim security lights. The air was still, thick with the ghosts of the day's labor, the scent of oil, metal, and ozone. I was performing my final rounds, a ritual of touch and sound, ensuring everything was secure. As I passed the old, unused cabinet in the corner, the one that held obsolete parts and forgotten tools from my grandfather's era, a memory surfaced. Years ago, when I was first learning the business, my dad had joked, "If you ever need to hide something important, that's the place. No one ever looks in there." A cold knot tightened in my stomach, a premonition. I reached behind the cabinet, my fingers brushing against dust and cobwebs. And there, tucked into a narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall, I felt it, a folder. I pulled it out. It was red. A bright fire engine red, the kind you use when you don't want something to be lost. Stamped across the front in bold black letters was "Confidential." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I opened it. The words inside were a physical assault. They sucked the air from my lungs and left me dizzy, leaning against the cold metal of the cabinet for support. Transfer of ownership, effective date 4 months prior, new majority owner, Mason Pierce. My vision blurred. I scanned the pages, my eyes hunting for my own name. I found it only once, buried in an appendix. Employee list, Kelsey Rowan, shop foreman. 10 years. My blood, my sweat, my youth, my devotion. Erased with the flourish of a lawyer's pen. A signature from my father. A signature from my mother. I was no longer family. I was labor. A line item. Expendable. I stumbled to a stool beside the CNC mill. My mill. The one I'd nursed through a dozen breakdowns. The one that knew the pressure of my hands as well as I did, and collapsed onto it. I stared at my hands, resting on my knees. They were good hands, strong, capable. They could read a blueprint, calibrate a machine to within 1,000th of an inch, soothe a worried client. Hands that had built their success, filled their bank accounts, burnished their reputation. Hands they had quietly, deliberately replaced. And then, cutting through the static of my despair, I heard Grandpa Arthur's voice, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Steele remembers. The words landed not as a comfort, but as a verdict. Steele remembered. It remembered my hands. But people forgot. People betrayed. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. It wasn't the stillness of defeat, but the quiet of a decision made. The storm of emotion had passed, and what remained was a crystalline clarity. This was over. I stood up. My movements were precise, economical. I went to each machine, the ones that had been my companions, my teachers. I didn't speak to them. I simply laid a hand on each of their cold frames in a final, silent farewell. I shut down the main power at the breaker panel, plunging the shop into a deeper silence. At my workstation, I took a clean sheet of company letterhead. I wrote a single sentence, my handwriting steady and sure. I resign, effective immediately. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it with regret. I just left it on my father's desk, in the center of his pristine leather blotter. Then, I gathered the only things in that building that truly belonged to me. From the bottom drawer of my tool chest, I took my grandfather's old welding gloves, the leather cracked and stiff with age. I retrieved my personal tool notebook, its pages filled with a decade of sketches, formulas, and solutions. And from the wall, I took the small, framed black and white photo of Grandpa Arthur, standing proudly by the very first milling machine he'd ever bought. I walked out to my truck, the cold air a shock. I didn't cry. I didn't scream curses at the building. I didn't look back. As I turned the key and the old engine sputtered to life, I whispered into the darkness, the words meant for a man long gone. I tried, Grandpa. I really tried. For a week, I existed in a state of suspended animation. My friend Tori, who owned a bakery a few blocks away, had a small apartment above it. She took one look at my face when I showed up on her doorstep, my duffel bag in hand, and simply handed me a key. "Stay as long as you need," she said, no questions asked. The apartment was small and smelled of yeast, cinnamon, and sugar, a complete sensory inversion from the world I'd left. The silence there was different. In the shop, silence was a temporary state, a pause waiting to be filled with noise and purpose. Here, the silence felt heavy, thick, a wool blanket smothering me. But as the days passed, the weight began to change. It started to feel less like a burden and more like a cleansing. It was the silence of a wound being allowed to scab over without being picked at. There were no demands, no expectations, no betrayals. Just the soft sounds of the city outside and the comforting, pre-dawn rumble of Tori preparing her pastries downstairs. Each morning, I'd find a fresh cup of coffee left on the counter for me. She never pressed, never offered platitudes. Her quiet solidarity was a balm. On the 8th day, my phone, which had been a silent, dead thing, lit up. The screen flashed, "Dad." I let it ring. The sound was an intrusion, a jarring echo from a life I was trying to shed. It went to voicemail. He called again and again. On the 4th call, Some deep-seated, conditioned instinct made my thumb slide across the screen to answer. I said nothing. Kelsey. His voice was strained, panicked, a far cry from his usual booming confidence. Kelsey, are you there? We've got a situation. Titan Steel, they're pulling the Hollander account. They're citing consistent delays and quality issues on the last 3 shipments. Mason can't fix it. He doesn't understand the technical specs. They're talking about a full audit of our processes. This could sink us. Please, you have to come back. You have to help us. I let his desperation hang in the air for a moment, feeling its texture. It wasn't concern for me. It wasn't an apology. It was a cry for a firefighter to put out a blaze they'd started themselves. I took a slow, deep breath, the calm I'd found in Tori's apartment solidifying into something stronger, something unbreakable. Let the air handle it. The silence on his end was profound. It was the sound of a man realizing for the first time that the tool he had taken for granted had a will of its own and was now being used against him. I could hear his ragged breathing, the faint background noise of the shop, the very sounds of the empire he was watching crumble. You can't be serious, he stammered. Kelsey, this is the family business. Your family. The word was a trigger. It no longer held warmth. It was a weapon. No, I said, my voice flat and final. I was labor. And you already chose your family. I ended the call. The screen went black. For the first time in my life, the silence that followed wasn't filled with anxiety or obligation. It was filled with power. It was my silence, my terms. The news traveled through the local manufacturing community like a shockwave. Rowan Metalworks was in trouble. Titan Steel Dynamics wasn't just a client. They were the cornerstone. Their departure was a vote of no confidence, and other, smaller clients began to get nervous. Payments were delayed. Orders were put on hold. I heard it all through the grapevine, from former suppliers who'd always liked me, from machinists at other shops who'd seen Mason's incompetence firsthand. Mason's slick confidence, so effective in a boardroom, was useless on a shop floor. Facing a technical crisis, it cracked, revealing the panic beneath. It was during this time that an email arrived in my personal inbox. The subject line was simple. Saw the news. Need to talk. It was from Nora Park. We'd been friends in college, a fierce, brilliant woman who'd always said she was going to be a lawyer to fight for the people who actually do the work. She was now a partner at a respected firm downtown. We met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. I slid the red folder across the table to her. She opened it, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the documents. She didn't react with shock or pity, just a focused intensity. Then she opened her laptop and I showed her the financial records I'd secretly backed up, the revenue charts that climbed steeply during my years running the floor, and the sharp, precipitous drop that coincided with Mason's ascent. Nora tapped a perfectly manicured nail on one specific line in the transfer document. Founder intent, she said. Courts take that very seriously, especially with small family-owned businesses. The original vision matters. She scrolled through the financials, a slow smile spreading across her face as she pointed to a series of dubious expense reports from Mason. And this, financial misuse of company assets for personal gain. Even better. We built the case together, piece by painstaking piece, in the quiet of her office after hours. It was like assembling a mosaic of betrayal. We had client emails specifically praising my precision and work ethic. We had the hard data showing revenue climbing under my de facto leadership and crashing under Mason's official one. We had records of Mason's company credit card being used for things that had nothing to do with metalworking. Lavish client dinners at steakhouses on nights when no clients were in town. Tickets to Packers games. A suspicious number of charges at high-end clothing stores. Then one evening, there was a knock on Tori's bakery door. It was Hank, the old grizzled machinist who had worked for my grandfather. He'd stayed on through my father's tenure, a relic of a more honest time. He held a dusty cardboard box. "Your grandfather gave this to me for safekeeping," he said, his voice gravelly. "Said if the place ever lost its way, I should make sure it got to the right person." Inside were my grandfather's personal documents, not just sentimental items, but his original business philosophy typed on a manual typewriter. Phrases leaped out at me. Team share. Joint ownership of the value we create. Collective value is not just profit, but skill and loyalty. He hadn't just built a company. He'd built a creed, and my parents had violated every tenet of it. Nora read through the documents, her eyes gleaming. "This is it," she said, looking up at me. "This isn't just a lawsuit, Kelsey. This is a reclamation." She closed the folder and met my gaze. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. Not as their wounded daughter, not as the scorned heir, but as the person who had built the place, whose hands were remembered in the very steel of its products. I was ready to take back what was mine. The courtroom was everything I expected and nothing I could have prepared for. It was cold, the air conditioned to a sterile chill. It was quiet, the silence heavy with the weight of the law. The lighting was harsh, bleaching the color from everyone's faces. My parents and Mason sat at the defendant's table. They looked smaller. My father's shoulders, usually thrown back with pride, were slumped. My mother's hands were clasped tightly together on the table, her knuckles white. Mason wore an expensive suit, but it seemed to hang on him now, his confidence replaced by a pale, sweaty anxiety. Nora was a vision of calm, surgical precision. She presented our case not with fiery rhetoric, but with the devastating, inexorable logic of facts. She showed the charts, read the emails, displayed the financial records. She painted a picture of systematic devaluation and calculated betrayal. Then she projected my grandfather's typed words onto the screen for the entire court to see. "A business is not its assets, it is its people. Whoever builds with their hands and mind owns a piece of its soul. That is the only inheritance that matters." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I saw my father flinch as if struck. When Mason took the stand, it was a demolition. Nora's questioning was polite, relentless. "Pierce, can you name 3 of Titan Steel's primary quality control specifications for the Hollander component?" Mason stammered, his eyes darting toward my father. I'd have to refer to the documentation." "How do you set up the CNC mill for a run of titanium alloy?" "We have technicians for that," he said, wiping his brow. "What was the company's gross revenue in the last fiscal year?" "I'd have to check the reports." "And in your role as operations director, how many hours a week would you say you spend, as your grandfather put it, building with your hands?" He looked utterly bewildered. I'm not directly involved with the equipment." The judge, an older man with a weary, intelligent face, stared at Mason as if he were a strange and previously undiscovered species. The ruling, when it came, was swift and unambiguous. The transfer was nullified, deemed a violation of the founder's intent and a breach of fiduciary duty given my contributory role. The company, now teetering on insolvency thanks to Mason's mismanagement, was to be liquidated. The proceeds from the sale of assets were to be split evenly between me and my sister, Jenna. The gavel struck. Crack. It was over. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile triumphantly at my family. I just felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was the feeling of a terrible, long journey being over. It felt like finally, after years of breathing smoke and toxic air, I could take a full, clean breath. 2 months later, the settlement landed in my bank account. $62,700. After legal fees, it wasn't a fortune. It wouldn't buy a lifestyle. But it was enough. It was seed capital. I found a space in a dated but clean industrial park, a fraction of the size of Rowan Metal Works, but it was mine. The walls were cinder block, the floor was concrete, and it was perfect. I spent weeks there alone, painting, running electrical conduit, and cleaning. I bought 2 used but well-maintained milling machines at an auction. It was a start. I named it Rowan Seal Core. It wasn't a resurrection of the old company. It was a rebirth, something new, built on the ashes of the old, but stronger, purer, and entirely my own. The phone rang one morning. It was the head of procurement at Titan Steel. "Heard you were back in business, Kelsey," he said. "No small talk. We've got a prototype we need spun up. Nasty tolerances. We sent it to 3 other shops. They can't hold it. Can you?" I looked at the empty, waiting machines. "Email me the prints." He did. I studied them. It was a challenging part, the kind I lived for. I quoted the job, a fair price for premium work. He agreed without hesitation. They didn't want the Rowan name. They didn't want the family. They wanted me, my hands, my mind, my integrity. By summer, the small shop was humming, the sound a familiar, comforting melody. The machines, once cold and silent, now warmed to my touch, their vibrations a language I understood. One afternoon, the door opened and Hank walked in. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to the older of the 2 mills, the one I'd spent a week rebuilding. He placed his hand on it, feeling its steady, healthy hum. He nodded, a slow, satisfied gesture. "He'd have been proud, you know," he said, his voice soft. "Arthur, he'd have been real proud." I walked over and ran my own hand along the cool, solid steel of the machine's frame. "Maybe," I said, "but I'm proud too." The morning light streamed through the high windows of my shop, hitting the floating motes of metal dust in the air, making them glitter like gold dust. I stood in the center of the space, my space, not inherited through birthright, not granted through favoritism, but rebuilt by my own will, my own hands, and my own money. People have a misconception about revenge. They think it's loud. They picture shouting matches, public shaming, the schadenfreude of watching your enemies fall. But sometimes, the most powerful revenge is silent. It's the quiet satisfaction of working in the very place they tried to erase you from. It's the dignity of standing taller than the people who underestimated you, not because you've crushed them, but because you've risen above the need to. It's the profound peace of rebuilding your world with your own 2 hands, according to your own blueprint. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A new email, another order, this one a 6-month contract with a new cutting-edge aerospace startup, renewable. I didn't feel a surge of excitement or a need to call someone and share the news. The validation I had once desperately sought from my family no longer held any tower over me. And for the first time, I truly meant it. The machines knew my touch. The work, perfect and precise, knew my worth. And now, after a long and painful journey, I knew it too. The buzzer on the CNC mill chimed, signaling the completion of the first run of the new contract. A perfect piece. I lifted it from the machine, the metal still warm, and placed it on the inspection table. As I did, my phone vibrated again, not another notification, but an incoming call. The screen flashed. "Dad." I watched it ring. The sound was no longer a trigger of anxiety, but a distant echo from a life I had closed the door on. I remembered a story Grandpa told me once about a Japanese art called kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer, understanding that the breaks and repairs are part of the object's history, making it more beautiful, more valuable, for having been broken. They broke me, and with these hands, I put myself back together, not to hide the cracks, but to fill them with gold. The phone went silent. A final, quiet surrender. I picked up my calipers and began measuring the finished part. Every dimension was perfect. Every surface, flawless. This was more than a business, more than a shop. It was my kintsugi, and the sound of reclamation wasn't a shout or a gavel or a slammed door. It was the quiet, unwavering hum of a machine that knew my hands. It was the soft click of a caliper confirming perfection. It was the sound of my own breath, steady and calm, in a space that was entirely and finally my own.